And welcome to another edition of Strange Planet. And for those of you watching on YouTube, as you can see, I'm away from the home studio, and I'm at my mom's place in Brantford, just about 90 minutes down the 401 and the 403 from Old Thornhill, where I usually am perched. And Mom's doing great. She's approaching her 98th birthday, and it's great to have had a week to spend with her. We're going to get into the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the amazing work of this Gothic horror author, Edgar Allan Poe, certainly an American treasure. And we're going to get into his life and mysterious death, as I say, with Mark Dewitziak, who is a journalism graduate of George Washington University. Mark has worked as a theater, film, and television critic since 1979. He started his journalism career in the Washington, D.C. Bureau of Knight Ridder newspapers and the Associated Press. He's been the television critic for the Plain Dealer in Cleveland, Ohio, since the late 90s, as a member of the Television Critics Association Board of Directors for 5 years, and he has won 5 Cleveland Press Club Awards for entertainment writing, as well as a Society of Professional Journalists Award for coverage of a variety of different issues. And he's the author of The Night Stalker Companion and Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. And his latest is, as I say, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Mark, welcome back to Strange Planet. How are you?
It's good to be back. I'm good. How can I be bad? And we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe. So how can we possibly be bad?
So just if you could give us your impressions about Poe's importance in the literary field and the mark that he left on the Gothic horror genre in American literature.
Well, it's not only the mark that he's left; it's how we define it. I think people are always kind of surprised to find out that Edgar Allan Poe's collected works runs to beyond 17 volumes. When they collected Poe's works in the early 1900s, there was 17 volumes of work, and we've discovered quite a bit since then. And about this much of it is what we would call today Gothic or horror. About that much of it is it's just that it is so resonant, and he was so good at it that it has overshadowed everything else he did. So we branded Poe. Branding is it's a 20th century American conceit where we brand a writer or an actor or a director. Well, Hitchcock made thrillers, or John Ford made westerns, or Stephen King is a horror writer. We kind of did that with Poe. Was we took those small group of stories and we completely defined him. And fame has been something of a double-edged sword for Poe. On the one hand, that small group of stories has kept him alive. Not only kept him alive, but has kept him probably the best read American writer around the world. And I'd say in the United States and around the world. And I don't even think there's a good second choice, because everybody gets Poe. You got Poe, I got Poe, all God's chillins get Poe. Everybody at some point in junior high school, right about the 7th grade, gets The Telltale Heart and The Raven and The Cask of Amontillado and The Black Cat. And it gets reintroduced throughout high school. And then if you take literature classes in college, you're probably going to get Poe again. So everybody gets Poe. And they not only get Poe, they get Poe at such a great age. What a magnificent age to give kids Poe. Right around, early adolescence, 7th grade. You're just at the point where your imagination needs that great jump start. And not only that, but we're probably reading is considered a chore. Most kids in the 7th grade don't look forward to reading and reading assignments. And then all of a sudden, we're giving them Edgar Allan Poe. And what's Poe doing? Oh, he's walling people up in catacombs and dismembering corpses and putting people in torture chambers. And reading is all of a sudden fun. It's like, this is reading? This is great. This is fantastic. And not only do kids love getting Poe at that age, teachers love teaching Poe at that age because everybody comes alive. Ironic, because Poe writes about death, but everybody comes alive when Poe is taught. So two things have kind of kept Poe going. This is a 1-2 punch that have kept him alive. For somebody who died in 1849, the pop culture, because the pop culture not only has relentlessly embraced Poe and marketed Poe. Poe is the most marketed writer. We have Poe action figures, Poe plushies, Poe buttons, Poe socks, Poe tea, Poe there are more items devoted to Edgar Allan Poe than any other writer in the history of the planet. There's no clear second choice. All you have to do is look at Etsy and look at how many items are offered for Poe, and then look at any other writer, Shakespeare, Twain, anybody else. Poe's way out in front. You can walk into a Barnes and Noble store or BAM and see shelves of merchandise devoted to Poe. Where are the shelves for Longfellow? Where are the shelves for Melville? They don't exist. So the pop culture has not only kept Poe alive, but kept him recognizable. Is that if I say Edgar Allan Poe, you got a vision in your head. You got an image of who Poe is. How many people could pick Longfellow or Melville out of a police lineup if you ask them to identify them? But they not only know who Poe is, they know what he looks like. You can put Poe on T-shirts. You can put Poe on buttons, and people, oh, Edgar Allan Poe. Well, that kind of fame is almost impossible for a writer. That's 24-karat celebrity fame. And so Poe has that because the pop culture and curriculum has combined to keep him not just alive, but the most alive writer. Poe dies in 1849 under mysterious circumstances.
Yes.
He's buried the next day. He's buried again the next day because somebody he thought was a friend, but was actually a bitter enemy, writes an obituary in a New York newspaper that begins our mystifying of Poe. He did everything he could to make Poe sound like a scoundrel and a drunkard and a derelict. And then in the 1870s, they dug him up and we buried him yet again because they wanted to put a nice monument where, well, there wasn't room for that monument in the place where he was originally buried in the Baltimore Cemetery. So they moved him. They buried him again. Poe, this guy's been buried more times. But if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe stories, there's one truism: nothing stays buried. And that's true of Poe. Poe has jumped out of the grave.
Isn't it amazing that he died?
He
died just as he wrote, as he lived, steeped in mystery. I mean, obviously the circumstances surrounding his death, very tragic, and died too young. But in a way, I wonder if he would have been looking down on all of this mystery and kind of smiling and thinking, wow, this would have made a great book.
A Poe scholar that I interviewed for the book said that it's almost as if a PR agent stepped in at one point and said, you know, Eddie, the best thing for you would be to die at 40, and not just die at 40, but die under circumstances which reflect your two greatest literary achievements. You invented the modern horror story, and Poe dies under circumstances which would not be out of place in one of his own horror stories. And you invented the modern detective story, the mystery story. And Poe leaves us with a mystery. He not only leaves us with a mystery, he leaves us with a double-barreled mystery, which is not just what did he die of, but also what happened to him during the missing days before he died, because he goes missing. And there's no witnesses that have ever come forward to say so much as, oh, yes, I passed him on the street during those days, or I had a drink with him. Nothing. There's nothing. So Poe leaves us under circumstances which are reflective of his two greatest literary achievements. Well, if that's not the greatest literary stage exit in history, I don't know what is. You know, there have been some really good ones, really, really good stage exit. Moliere. You know, Moliere was a playwright as well as being an actor. And Moliere is dying as they are premiering his latest play. And he's dying of tuberculosis, and he can barely get through the performance, and he collapses on stage, and they drag him into the wings and they revive him, and he goes back and he finishes the play and he goes home and he dies. That is pretty good for a playwright and an actor. And then there's Twain, who was born with Halley's Comet in the night sky in 1835 and correctly predicts that he will die. when the comet comes back in 1910, 74 years later, and he pulls it off. He does it. That's pretty good. But in some way, Poe beats them all, because Poe actually dies under circumstances which is reflective of his two greatest literary achievements and what we're still championing him for today. And that is certainly one thing that is, there's an irony to that how he died. It's the reason for the subtitle of the book being reversed. A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Because frequently, most biographies start where any life would start, when somebody is born. You always kind of start a biography, and with Poe, it always seems reversed. The conversation always seems to start with how he died. It always seems to begin with his death, not with his life. So I reversed it. I made it The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, not just because of that, but also because of what we were just talking about, is that, yeah, he dies, but his afterlife is immense. He's going to escape it all. He's going to have the last laugh. He's going to be remembered more than the people who were supposed to outlive him. All those writers who were supposed to be better than he was and greater than he was, and their fame would outshine him and outlast him. Where are they? Mm. Where are they?
You mentioned, I want to get into the life, and then of course we'll get to the mysterious death. But you mentioned that basically giving birth to detective fiction and predating Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. Did Arthur Conan Doyle, did he give credit to Edgar Allan Poe? Was he a fan of Edgar Allan Poe?
Yes, and not only gave him credit, but did so several times. There's the first known one is right after Sherlock Holmes became a sensation. Conan Doyle visited America, and reporters flocked to see him, and they were kind of baiting him, because they were Americans and they wanted to take the pride of that Poe had gotten there first, and Poe had created the model for the super sleuth. Poe's detective C. Auguste Dupin is featured in 3 short stories that Poe wrote. And he is the model for not only Sherlock Holmes, but Hercule Poirot, Lord Peter Wimsey, all the sort of super sleuths that are going to follow. The people who walk into a room, they're brighter than anybody else, and they see what nobody else sees, and therefore can solve the seemingly impossible mysteries. Well, that conceit is what Poe came up with. So the reporters kind of, figuring Conan Doyle would bristle a little bit. Didn't Poe come up with this first? And he surprised them all. Doyle basically said, yes, that's exactly right. Poe came up with it first. Everybody else is living off of what Poe did. And he repeats this. So often he does a speech on the 100th anniversary of Poe's birth in 1909. He gives a speech and he basically says, where was the mystery story before Edgar Allan Poe breathed life into it? So yes, Doyle not only acknowledged Poe's influence, he championed Poe. He was a champion of Poe and Poe's influence, and certainly acknowledged that Poe was there first, and basically came up with the role model that everybody else, I don't want to say ripped off, we'll just say vamped on after that.
Stood on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
What was his childhood like? His formative years that molded him into this amazing writer?
The loss is sort of a key word with Poe. Poe is born in 1809. He is the son of actors. His father is not a very good actor, but his mother is. Eliza Poe is one of the great actors on the American stage. She's beautiful. She can sing, she can dance, she can do comedy, she can do tragedy, she can do Shakespeare. And if you were an actor back then, you had to do all those things. Being an actor was a very hard life in America in the early 1800s. You were traveling from town to town. You did not do one play in a town like today for a week or 2 weeks. You did different plays every single night because the audience, the theater going audience was small, so they wanted to see something different every single night. So you had to learn a staggering number of roles, and you had to be ready to do them at any point. The dressing rooms were horrible, beyond rat infested, dressing rooms. The hotels were not much better that they were staying in. They were traveling, and if cholera was raging, or smallpox, or yellow fever, or whatever, you were susceptible to all of it. And if you were not acting, you were expected to take tickets or tear down scenery or move scenery or whatever. So Elizabeth Poe, Eliza Poe she died at 24, and she died of tuberculosis. And Edgar is not yet 3 years old when she dies. Poe was born in Boston, but Eliza Poe died in Richmond, Virginia, and a city which loved her as an actress. So she dies there, and Poe is taken in by the Allan family. It's where the Allan part of his name comes part, Edgar Allan Poe. John Allan is a Richmond merchant. His wife is one of the women who took care of Eliza Poe as she was dying. And they take Edgar in. There are 3 children. The children are taken in by different families, and Edgar's taken in by the Allans. John Allan never formally adopts Edgar. He is a foster child, and he is made to feel that. He is given a very good upbringing. He's been given a good education. He is raised as a Southern aristocratic gentleman, but he is always reminded that he is an outsider and that he is the beneficiary of charity, if you will. So John Allan is a very forbidding presence, and the older Poe gets, the more they do not get along. And Allan eventually disinherits Poe completely. When John Allan dies, extraordinarily wealthy, he could have left a very little bit amount of money to Poe, and it would have been sufficient for Poe to have been comfortable for the rest of his life. John Allan leaves nothing to Edgar Allan Poe. John Allan leaves money to illegitimate children, and he doesn't leave any money to Poe. So Poe, he tries going to the University of Virginia. John Allan sends him to the University of Virginia at Charlottesville without enough money, without sufficient money. So Poe falls to gambling, and he tries alcohol for the first time. And alcohol is going to become a continuing problem throughout his life. Not the problem that most people think it is, because like everything else with Poe, there's misconceptions. And one of the misconceptions of Poe was that he was perpetually drunk. No, there was long periods of sobriety. You don't live to be 40. Write enough to fill 17 volumes of work of high quality with being inebriated all the time. So there are these long documented periods where he is sober. But one thing we pretty certain of is that Poe was allergic to alcohol. He would take one drink, and he never savored a drink. He never sipped it. He just charged it back, and he was immediately drunk on that much alcohol. It looked like he'd been drinking for hours. And then the recovery period was on. It wasn't just a morning hangover for Poe. It took days for him to recover from these bouts of alcohol. So Poe wasn't drinking like we think of, a perpetual drunk drinks. Poe's problem is that he takes the worst possible time to drink throughout his life. Whenever it's going to do him the most harm, you can bet that's the moment he takes a drink. And that's true in a lot of things with Poe's life. He's a lot of times his own worst enemy. He takes the worst moment to pick a fight with somebody or to alienate somebody who could do him some good. This is a theme throughout his life. But he is looking, he loses his foster mother. He loses his mother. His brother dies of tuberculosis when he's in his 20s. He's going to lose his wife when she's in her early 20s to tuberculosis. So there is this pattern of loss throughout his life, and he's always sort of searching for family. There's always this search for the stability of a family, and he kind of finds that in Baltimore. After he's in the army, he tries West Point, and then he goes and moves in with his aunt, Maria Clem, in Baltimore. And here is where he finds what he so badly needs. And he marries his first cousin, who is 13 at the time. Mm-hmm. And, you might as well go ahead and say that and get the ick factor out there.
Well,
because everybody's going to do it anyway. All I can say is marrying young was not that odd back then, and marrying your first cousin was not that odd back then. It has a tremendous ick factor now.
It's 100
But
years before Jerry Lee Lewis.
but right, and Poe was sensitive to it, by the way. Poe changed her age on the marriage certificate to 17. So he clearly was a little sensitive to it. But no matter what you think of it, it was a happy marriage. They were devoted to each other. It was a very, for as long as Virginia lived. So basically, his aunt, Maria Clem, becomes his mother-in-law. And the three of them are a household. And they are very happy. They love each other, very supportive of each other. It is here Poe finds that unconditional love he needs. And not surprisingly, he enters in this golden period of writing. He moves to Philadelphia in around 1838. And it's there. It's actually in Philadelphia. He's there about 6 years. And he writes most of the stories we know him for. He writes The Telltale Heart and The Fall, The House of Usher, excuse me, and The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Black Cat. Almost all of these are written in this time period. Excuse me.
Mark, I'm going to jump in here. Pardon the interruption. I'm going to take a quick time out. You get a glass of water, and we'll be back to discuss the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. Mark Dewitziak stays with us.
Every new season, we find a reason to improve our lives and our health. And C60 Evo organic edible oils deliver noticeable benefits quickly. A spoonful in the morning delivers energy and endurance all day long. And I sleep deeper and wake up feeling refreshed because C60 ESS60 works. Carbon 60 received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996 when it was used for industrial applications. C60 Evo's ESS60 is a breakthrough technology upgrading C60 to be safe for human and pet consumption. ESS60 has been called a miracle molecule because of the physical and mental benefits people are enjoying. Their lab has a proven track record of 31 years and thousands of happy customers across the world just like me. So treat yourself, your friends, and your family to C60 Evo and use my link EVRS to get 10% off your first order. Again, my link EVRS to get 10% off your first order.
And we are back with Mark Dewitziak, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. How do we get a copy?
Oh, it's a St. Martin's publication, so anywhere at a bookstore near you, Amazon, any online bookseller, it's readily available through just about anywhere.
All right, so let's get to the summer of 1849.
Okay.
Edgar Allan Poe embarks. Was it a speaking tour?
No, it was not. It was more the dream of Poe's life was to own and edit his own magazine. This was what he really see. Poe was the first American writer to try to live only by writing. Most writers of that century had other jobs. They taught. They were at universities. They whatever they were worked in government jobs, but Poe wanted to try to live by his talent, and that was hard to do because there were no copyright laws. Poe was compensated very little for his best work because as soon as it was published, he might get paid for it right up front, but then it was stolen and duplicated up and down the eastern seaboard, and there was nothing stopping it. So Poe made very little money off of what he did. One way you could make money was if you actually were the proprietor of your own magazine, and that's what Poe really always wanted. He always wanted to have his own outlet that he controlled. In that last year, he finally found a backer for what he called the stylus, his magazine, and what he was doing was he was taking a little bit of a trip down to Richmond. He was living in New York at the time, in what is now the Bronx. He was living in a small cottage there. And so he's heading really for Richmond, and he's trying to raise money for the magazine. He's trying to get subscriptions. He's trying to do interest. And if he can lecture here or there, he was a wonderful performer. He loved giving lectures. He was very good at it. He was very good at doing his own poetry and doing lectures on the poetic principle or whatever. He was a mesmerizing speaker. And so if he could lecture a couple times, and he did that summer, he would do that as well. But that was sort of another way of kicking up interest in the magazine. So he leaves for New York on his way to Richmond. He's going to stop in Philadelphia and then go on to Richmond. And the book is structured as with a dual timeline. We bounce back and forth between those last 4 months, those desperate last 4 months of his life that are going to take him to Baltimore, and his death in October. And those chapters alternate with the big chapters about the various portions of his life. And then the two timelines meet at the end. And I present my theory as to what I think Poe died of.
We won't reveal that. People can read the book to find that out. But
yeah, thank you. I prefer not to. Although I will say it is not a theory I insist on. I've been very, very clear about this from the beginning. When the idea of the book was actually not mine. I love Edgar Allan Poe. I've carried him throughout my entire life. I actually read him before junior high school. So I mean, I was a monster kid. What we call the monster kid. We didn't have that term back in the 60s. We just said we're horror fans. But now we call people who watched Universal horror movies and 50 science fiction movies and the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limb. We now say, oh, you were a monster kid. And so yeah, I was. I have all 13 of my Aurora monster models right over here.
I'm envious, Mark. I'm envious.
My childhood. And so I knew Poe. I knew and loved Poe, even before junior high school. But I never really thought of myself as a candidate to write his biography. And it was an editor at St. Martin's who suggested it. But I think he also was thinking about a book that would solve definitively the mystery of how Poe died. And sort of one of those books that arrive every 2 years purporting to finally solve the case of who Jack the Ripper is. We get that book every 2 years without fail, it seems. So, I said to this editor at the time, I said, like, whoa. You do understand this is a cold case. There was no autopsy. And had there been an autopsy, it would have been worthless because they didn't really know how to do autopsies in the 1800s. It was the Civil War was the defining moment for the art of the autopsy because we got very good at cutting up bodies and dissecting them. So if Poe had died, 20, 30 years later, he would have had a very good autopsy probably, but he had no autopsy, no death certificate, no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to any forensic tests, no reliable witnesses. All of the witnesses to Poe's death are not only unreliable, they contradict each other and sometimes themselves. Even the attending physician leaves behind 3 accounts of Poe's death. He actually changes the time of death between accounts. And in one point, he also changes Poe's last words. So this guy is the one guy we need to be completely reliable in his observational skills is totally unreliable. So I said, if that's the kind of book you want, you better go find yourself another lunatic because, this one's driving away. And I said, but I'll tell you what I will do. I will write a book about how Edgar Allan Poe lived, the mystery of his life, because how he lived fascinates me more than how he died. And I will examine his life through the prism of that mystery. And if I can come up with what I think is a compelling theory as to how he died, I will present it. And if I can disprove certain theories along the way, because we're up to about 25 theories as to how Poe died, I will do that. I said, but what I will not do is I will not claim that it can be definitively proved. I can build a very good circumstantial case, but I'm not going to go so far as to say there is definitive proof for this. That would be irresponsible. And I will not. Well, they were happy with that. They said, that's good. That's fine. We'll take it according to those rules. And that's precisely what I did. I think I came up with a cause that makes sense. I think I've come up with a way that Poe died that makes a very compelling case. But if you ask me, can I prove it? I will tell you without question, no. And I'm not even sure I want to prove it. There are some mysteries which are better off not known. And I think there's a certain romanticism to Poe dying under mysterious circumstances. So if anybody says to me, I don't think you're right, I think he died of this, I said, fine. You know, I've got no dog in the fight.
Right.
You know, this is my theory as to how he died.
The questions are always more interesting than the answers, ultimately.
Right. Exactly.
Let's get into a little bit what we do know, because as you mentioned, he was on his way from Richmond to New York via Baltimore.
Right. Yeah. Baltimore would have been where the steam. He gets on a steamer in Richmond. That's where his last seen. Some friends take him off to the docks in Richmond. He gets on the steamer, and that's it. That's like a curtain coming down at that point, because at that point, until he is found a few days later, insensible, wearing clothes that were not his own, in front of a polling place in Baltimore, there is not one person who has ever stepped forward to say, yeah, I had a conversation with him on the steamer at the railing, or I passed him on the street in Baltimore, or nothing. You know, you would think, well, at least one or two people might have come forward after Poe's death to say, yes, I was there, I saw this, or I saw that. There's nothing. There's nothing. Those days are completely shielded from our view. So we don't even know what condition Poe was in when he left Richmond.
Did he not? Didn't he stop in Richmond before he got on the ferry to see a doctor for a fever, or is that apocryphal?
No, he didn't. That's kind of the funny thing is he goes to see the woman who he had an understanding. They might have been formally engaged, or had an understanding. We're not really sure whether they were formally engaged, but this was actually a childhood sweetheart from that he had gotten back in touch with, Elmira Royster Shelton. And they clearly had an understanding, and he probably was going to end up marrying her. He goes to see her the night before he's going to leave. And she said Poe looked feverish, his pulse was racing. She thought he looked so badly, she thought he wasn't going to get on the steamer. He would be in no condition to make the trip. So when Poe left her house, he left her with the impression that he was a very sick man. Now, he immediately leaves the house of Elmira, and he goes to see the doctor you're talking about, Dr. Carter. And he stays with Dr. Carter. He reads some of the magazines, and Dr. Carter, they talk pleasantly. He mistakenly takes Dr. Carter's sword cane with him when he goes. And he says he's going to meet friends for dinner. Dr. Carter he leaves behind a full account of this. And remember, he's a doctor. He makes no mention of Poe looking sick, acting sick, no fever, nothing. It's a perfect. So within the few minutes it takes Poe to go from Elmira Royster Shelton's house to Dr. Carter's house, you get two completely different descriptions of Poe's general health. He then has dinner with friends. He says to Dr. Carter, I'm going to go have dinner with friends. He does. And he has a good time with his friends. And they see him off and they don't mention that he looks sick or ill. This is the kind of wildly contradictory evidence that always surrounds Poe's last days. Which evidence do we put our stock in? Do we put it in the hands of a doctor who was with him and doesn't comment on whether Poe looks ill or not? You would think he would. If Poe was looking as ill as Elmira said he looked, you would think a medical doctor would have commented on it. Elmira is so sure he's not going to make the trip. She goes to his boarding house the next day. Sure, he's going to be there. And he only to learn, no, he left. He's gone. He got on the steamer. So this is the type of thing you always have to take account into Poe. You have to weigh the evidence very, very carefully with Poe and say, here's what this person says, but look, you've got witnesses here and here, and they say this. You can't be selective about your witnesses. You have to present all of it and say, okay, this is what the record is. I'm not trying to build a case for one for the other. I am trying to tell you exactly what happened.
Even the great Poirot, I think, would have been stumped by this case. We'll take another time out. Back with more of my conversation with Mark Dewitziak as we discuss the mysterious death and life of Edgar Allan Poe.
November reminds us to be thankful and focused on boosting our radiant health before winter. And I use a potent remedy that's improved the quality of my life and deepened my sleep as well. I take C60 Evo olive oil every morning, and I have a lot more energy and mental focus all day long. My workouts are easier, and I have a lot more endurance. If you're into competitive sports, this is a game changer. Health is our greatest wealth, and Pura C60 ESS60 really works. ESS60 is a breakthrough technology delivering the carbon-60 miracle molecule for humans and pets. Check out the C60 Evo holiday gift collections for everyone on your list. They make amazing skin, lip, and hair repair serum that deliver noticeable results quickly. C60 Evo's lab has an impressive track record of 31 years and, of course, my personal recommendation. You deserve the best remedies on earth, and so do those you love. Buy direct from the lab and upgrade your life today. Use my code EVRS to save 10% off your first order. Again, my code EVRS and save 10% off your first order.
Mark Dewitziak is with us, and we are talking about Edgar Allan Poe, A Mystery of Mysteries, the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. And is that available on Amazon as well?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Terrific. All right. So Poe arrives, several days later in Baltimore?
Oh, he would have arrived almost. I mean, the trip to Baltimore on a steamer would he'd have been there very, very quickly. Now, looked like he had plans to go to Philadelphia. He would have probably got on a train in Baltimore and gone to Philadelphia. It's possible he did. He was going to edit a collection of poetry by a woman in Philadelphia. He's going to get paid for it. The woman's husband was going to pay him for this. So there were plans for him to go to Philadelphia, then go on to New York. Did he? We don't know. Like, again, these days there was time for him to do it. But we have no witnesses. If he went to Philadelphia, there are no witnesses in Philadelphia that said, yeah, he was here. Yeah, he did this. Yeah, he did that. He arrives in Baltimore. He would have disembarked from the steamer in Baltimore. Now, Baltimore was a very, very rough town back then. It had a reputation for being if you were an Eastern Seaboard city, if you had a harbor, you had a rough district. You had a rough area. And Baltimore, even for Eastern Seaboard reputation at the time, Baltimore was known as a tough town. In fact, they were known as Mob Town. That was their nickname back then, because they would riot at the drop of a hat. And they took their rioting very seriously. They would riot, and they would drive out the sheriff and the mayor. They would burn down the houses of rich people. It would take days for the militia and the army to restore order. This was a rough town, So if Poe arrived, and there was an election going on top of everything else, and that was rough times because there were roving bands of political thugs who would Shanghai people.
Right. Force you to vote for their candidate.
And they would make you repeat, not just vote, but repeat. They would take you from polling place to repeat vote. In between, they would keep you in an area which became known as a pen or a coop. So the practice became known as cooping. And this has become a leading theory as to what happened to Poe, was that if he were very sick, being kept, and it was a very cold early October, and it was cold, wet, damp. If he were being kept under these cooping conditions, it might explain why he was found in clothes that weren't his own, ill-fitting clothes, because they would change the clothes of the people so they would be harder for them to be recognized. It's a very good Baltimore theory as to why, to sort of explain the missing days and explaining why Poe was found in the condition in which he was found.
Yeah, delirious, seemingly in a drunken stupor, but maybe not, maybe just delirious from
There's no proof that he'd been
fever.
drinking. There's
Right.
absolutely no proof that he was drinking. It doesn't mean he wasn't, because people who were cooped sometimes were plied with liquor or drugs. So it's possible he had been given alcohol. But we don't know. Again, it's not, nobody took a blood alcohol test. Nobody tested his, that all comes from the fact that, Poe had bouts of drinking. So people assumed, aha, here he is insensible, in this state. He must have been drinking. And a doctor that he knows, Dr. Snodgrass, is sent for when he is taken inside the polling place, which was a tavern inn. So they take him inside, and this Dr. Snodgrass, who's an old friend, arrives, and he assumes Poe's been drinking. And he later goes on the lecture circuit as, guess what? A temperance speaker. He's an advocate of temperance. So it's to his best wishes in many ways for Poe to have died of drink. He can make Poe a cautionary tale and say, see, this is what killed the great Edgar Allan Poe. Don't drink, Well, the attending physician is just as sure Poe wasn't drinking. The attending physician said, no, Poe had not been drinking. There were also tests done on Poe's hair. There were snips of Poe's hair cut at the point of death. That was very common back then. People would take snips of hair as a souvenir, and they would send it to loved ones and things like that. There were many snips, and they survived, and the hair can be tested. It's one of the few things that survive of Poe that can be tested. And one of the things that can be tested is what shows up is what you consumed, what you ate, what your diet was like. We can tell all that from your hair for hair analysis. And the hair analysis, Poe took a temperance pledge when he was in Richmond, and it seems to bear out that he kept the pledge, that he had not been drinking during those last few weeks. So you can't rule it out. You can't say that he hadn't been given alcohol, that he hadn't been, but again, there's no evidence for it. There's and actually the evidence seems to go against it.
There's even this theory that because of the sort of the trajectory of the illness, he seemed to be better, then he got worse, and then he came out of it a little bit, then got worse again, that he may have had something like rabies.
It wasn't rabies. That was one of the things we know it wasn't. I mean, rabies has remained very popular. It became a theory, but there's two things. And again, you can't rule out anything. I can't, it's just as I can't definitively prove it was something, I can't definitively prove it wasn't. And that's because Poe dies under what is medically known as, or forensically known as, non-specific circumstances. If you look at the symptoms that Poe dies under, they fit an enormous number of possible causes. He was delirious, he was rambling, he was insensible, his nervous system was shot. A lot of things can cause that. A lot of possible things can cause that. Those symptoms are incredibly non-specific, and they're incredibly common for a lot of possible causes. So what somebody can do is you can take those symptoms and bend your theory around them. Mm-hmm. But you have to look at the best evidence. Best evidence suggests that Poe drank, was given water and bouillon and other things while he was in the hospital. If he took one sip of water, and he undoubtedly did while he was hospitalized, it wasn't rabies, because you can't drink. You have an aversion to water if you're dying from rabies. Also, the body, as soon as he was, taken to Washington Hospital, he was examined. There was no comment on a bite wound of any kind, so both of those things suggest it probably wasn't rabies. And I'll go so far as to say most likely not rabies. Can you rule out, could they have missed a bite? Could they have missed a wound? Yeah, anything's possible. But I think it's fairly clear he took liquids during the time he was in the days he was in. And if he had not been able to swallow water, it would have been remarked on. It would have been remarked. So that is one of the things I kind of say, unlikely.
The variations on and confusion surrounding his last words. What were some of the variations of his last words?
Oh, they're all melodramatic and terrible. They're words that Poe himself would hate. The most common one is, God have pity on my poor soul, or some such thing. It's this melodramatic claptrap. I'm sure Poe himself would have been embarrassed to have been suggested that these were his last words. And this all comes from Dr. John Moran, who was the attending physician. He'd only been a doctor for a few years. How much he was actually in attendance is not, we only have his word for those last days. And then we have his three accounts. And if you compare the three accounts, they have nothing to do with each other. The only thing that they have is that there's somebody who's dying named Edgar Allan Poe, and he eventually dies. That's about the only thing they have in common. Everything else he changes. And he famously says in one account that Poe yelled out the name Reynolds. And this has sent, decades of Poe scholars and fans searching for the identity of who Reynolds was. Who was he crying out for? And this, was it this explorer that he'd written about many years earlier? Was it some kind of election worker? Who was Reynolds? What if he didn't say it at all? What if this was just an invention of this doctor who later fancied himself a writer and started to write, and his writing is incredibly Victorian, heightened melodrama? That's just the type of thing maybe you'd put into something that, is a dramatic flair. Because in the second account, that detail disappears completely. If that is such a big detail and a distinctive detail that he yelled Reynolds for hours, shouldn't it make it into the second account? That's pretty big. No mention of this in the second account, but there is a name Reynolds, and now it's a family that came to visit him. It had the name Reynolds. And then in the third account, the family comes to visit him, but the family's no longer named Reynolds. They're now given another name. So the doctor's evidence, again, is you have to take almost everything that he says, that he left behind, with a certain amount of skepticism. And again, somebody who would actually change the time of death. At one point he changes the time of death to midnight. Oh, wouldn't it be great to have Poe die at midnight? That's better, So he changes the time of death. This is what you're dealing with. This is when I say you have unreliable witnesses. Poe was one of the great things that Poe created as a short story writer was the unreliable narrator. We read Poe, and is the narrator actually telling us the truth? How much can we trust of what this narrator is saying? Well, Poe's life is just a mess of unreliable witnesses, and that's true of his death, but it's true of his life too, so you have to take an awful lot. There's an awful lot about Poe we'll never know, and that's true of his life as much as it's true of his death.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it right there, and we're going to invite people to unravel the mystery and read A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Dewitziak. We just barely scratched the surface, and that's on purpose. That's on purpose. We want people to be sufficiently tantalized to read the book. Again, the St. Martin's Press is the publisher, and it's available at Amazon. Mark, great to meet you, or speak with you, rather, again. This is our second time around. Thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it greatly.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.